This is Radio Free Hillsdale, 101.7 FM. I'm Scot Bertram, and with me today is State Senator Mike Shirkey. Find him on senatormikeshirkey.com. Also on Facebook, he is the Senate Majority Leader and also the 16th State Senate District Representative, Branch, Hillsdale, and Jackson counties. Senator, thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Scott. It's been a little too long since we've last talked, but there's a fair amount that's gone on since then, so I'm sure we'll have a robust conversation.
Absolutely. We'll make the most of our time today, that's for sure. So, Senator, since the last time that we talked, the budget from the Senate and the House was completed. It was sent to Governor Whitmer, and of course, recently we learned what Governor Whitmer did with that budget, making certain line item vetoes, cutting spending in some areas like to schools, autism, not treatment, but autism assistance and other places. We can get to that in a second. Just walk people, if you could, through the last couple of weeks, finishing the budget on your end and then finding out what the governor has done with it.
Thank you, Scott, for the opportunity to share this with your listeners. Yes, the legislature finished up our budget almost 2 weeks ago. Prior to that, all the conference committees, which is the step before a budget's completed, were also put together. And so Governor Whitmer had almost 3 weeks of view of what the detail of the budget proposal was going to be. We finally delivered it to her in a format in which she could respond. And the interesting thing about this is that she simultaneously signed all the budgets, in other words, approved all the budgets, while vetoing 147 different line items within that budget, and more disturbingly, aggressively used an obscure law that allows a governor to assemble what's called a state administrative board and then do some, what I call unilateral transfers within budgets. And we'll get to that point in a moment because it's very important to put an emphasis on it. But the 147 line item vetoes represented most of her priorities when she submitted her budget proposal back in March. So one can only scratch their head and wonder what was the purpose of cutting all of the services that we frankly agree on. I think, the only conclusion one can reach is that she did it for the purposes of political aspirations and trying to get the legislature back to consider a large tax increase.
There's so many different points I want to make sure we get to. So let's start with this. Let's start with the spending first. And by that I mean the overall numbers. So we have the governor making these line item vetoes. Is the amount of spending happening under the budget now less than what you and the Senate approved? What's happening with the money that she has decided not to spend?
Well, it's not being spent, so it stays on the balance sheet, and it's just shy of $1 billion. Now, to be fair and clear, nothing that the governor did was unlawful, number one. And number two, that $1 billion of unallocated, unappropriated money, two-thirds of it is state money, and a little over a third is federal matching money, which we could not, return to taxpayers, so to speak, even if we wanted to. Mm-hmm. But it basically remains on the balance sheet until further action is taken or not.
Okay. Now, what about these transfers that you were talking about? What's happening there with the governor?
So there's this obscure law that was put into place in 1921. Only one governor has exercised it since 1921, and that was Governor Engler back in, I believe, 92. And even then, he did it with surgical precision. He was very precise in how to do it. And the reason why he was precise, and the reason why, in my opinion, every governor since 1921 has refused or stayed away from using that tool, is because it's a very dangerous tool. Let me put it to an extreme. If a governor would choose to use this tool as aggressively as Governor Whitmer has, then it basically obsoletes most of the input of the legislature, and the legislature would only be then allowed to determine how much money per budget can be spent, and a governor could, after that, determine exactly how every nickel is spent without any legislative input, which is completely inconsistent with our state constitution. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a dramatic evidence of her lack of concern for the process, her lack of concern for the legislature, her lack of concern for being a partner in something as important as a budget, and her ability to not be able to control herself in terms of taking what I consider to be rather derisive political actions.
State Senator Mike Shirkey with us on Radio Free Hillsdale, 101.7 FM, the Senate Majority Leader and also 16th District Representative. You mentioned the process there, Senator, and just to remind people, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on the dates, but the governor removed herself from these negotiations over the budget, about 3 weeks or so before the budget was due, and taking yourself away from the table clearly gives you less of an opportunity to discuss and weigh in on how that budget gets made.
She was very upset that Speaker Chatfield and I agreed to separate long-term road funding from the budget, which is something I've been advocating for since the beginning of the year because I thought it would compromise the process and compromise the products of both budget and road funding. But she was very upset that we chose to do what we've been doing for the last 8 years and squeeze out a few $100 million out of our current spending to apply on a one-time basis to the highest, ostensibly her highest priority, and that is the roads. And so she walked away from the negotiation because she didn't like the fact that we were going to do that. It would have been good if she had negotiated on that. We could have probably landed on a smaller number and everybody would have been happy. But as it turns out, she walked away, and so we had therefore no other recourse other than to finish the budget as responsibly as we could and send it to her so that we met our constitutional obligations. And I guarantee you, Scott, that any objective observer that would assess the budget that we've ultimately sent to her would conclude without question that it was for the most part, a bipartisan, down-the-middle, non-political budget. And I have great evidence for that because many of the budgets, because there's 17 of them, many of them received bipartisan support. So this was not a stick-in-the-eye budget presentation to the governor. It was something we were sincerely trying to get done and meet our obligations. And you're correct. If somebody walks away, that leaves those remaining at the table with no option other than to proceed.
Senator, some of the things that were among the vetoes in Jackson County, funding for a long-term opioid rehabilitation home that already is under construction, vetoing $1 million for the autism center, vetoing funding for charter schools. I mean, is it? I assume the answer is yes. You mentioned there's nothing here that's illegal, but funding what essentially charter schools are public schools. So funding different public schools at different levels, is that legal? Is that right?
Well, if it stands, it's going to be challenged for certain. But I think it just goes to show the desperation of her efforts to try to drive a wedge between the legislature and the people of Michigan and force us back to the table so that we have to cave into a tax increase, which is simply just not going to happen. I have made a personal commitment to go back to work on long-term road funding as soon as the budget was done, and I intend to do so. However, her egregious use of the State Administrative Board causes me pause as to whether I should engage in that, because it doesn't really, if she continues with that kind of practice, it really doesn't matter what we agreed to because she can change it. And that is the most important point of the entire critique of how she reacted, how my governor reacted to the budget process, and that is that unilaterally basically saying I can move things around and do things without regard for the legislature, and that is a dangerous precedent. And I think you can understand how those can be quickly connected, and all of a sudden we're approaching not a representative constitutional government, but more of a dictatorship.
Senator, correct me, of course, if I'm wrong, but I believe that the governor and the leaders have met at least one time since the vetoes have gone through. You have been very clear since that point. In your opinion, your perspective, the budget is done. If you want to move on to something else and talk about road funding or talk about whatever's next, let's do it, but the budget is done. So what was discussed in that meeting that you can tell us, and do you anticipate more meetings among the leaders?
Well, I certainly hope we meet more often. We meet again soon. That first meeting, post-budget approval, we really talked about the next 2 or 3 policy issues that we might be able to agree on, and I happened to bring them up, so I was the one that offered them, and I'm happy to do so. But to your point about the budget is done. We have a fiscal plan for 2020, budget year 2020. People have their marching orders. They know where the monies have been appropriated. But there's a whole lot of line items that, as you have well identified, have been vetoed. I believe the governor's having serious remorse on some of those line items. And what I'm suggesting to people, the people listening to this radio interview with you and I, talk to the governor's office, call the office, email the office, text the office, ask her if she thinks she made a mistake with any of those veto items, to ask the legislature to send those items back to her as vetoed. We'll likely oblige in that, and then she can correct her mistake, and we can reinstate those funding. The 147 line items, my guess is there may be 10 that need to be robustly negotiated. Mm-hmm. The rest of them were pretty consistent with what her proposal was in her budget.
And one other question, Senator, on road funding, which, of course, has been one of the cornerstones of the governor's first campaign and then time in office. Among those things she vetoed was, about $375 million in spending for roads and bridges. So under the current budget that she has approved, where is the spending on what is essentially her signature issue? Is it as it has been in the past? Where is it at?
It's less. We have fulfilled the 2015 law that we were incrementally increasing funding on an annual basis up to $1.2 billion per year going forward. We've completed that obligation, but other than that, there was no additional funding other than $25 million that we had in there for bridges. This is another really important point. She had done a photo tour, a media tour of bridges that were, in her mind, crises waiting to happen. We identified the 4 that she went to and says, these are the highest priority, let's fund those right now, get them checked off the list. She vetoed those. And then the $25 million that was set aside for just for her to help choose what next bridges the department would work on, she moved that to mass transit. So listen to that. High priority roads, $25 million dedicated to bridges. She unilaterally moved it to mass transit. If that isn't an inconsistency, I don't know what is.
Senator Mike Shirkey, the Senate Majority Leader. You can find him online, Senator Mike Shirkey, also on Facebook. Just search for Senator Mike Shirkey, representing Branch, Hillsdale, and Jackson counties. That's the 16th State Senate District. Senator, always wonderful to talk. Thanks for your time and insight today into the process.
Thank you, Scott, and I just want to have the last word here, if you would give me the privilege, and that is for your listeners, if they're disturbed by some of these line item vetoes, please reach out to the governor and ask the legislature to send them back for her so she can reinstate them.
That's State Senator Mike Shirkey.